So welcome along to a video that's going to help you with your graphing and mapping exercise. So the first thing that you should have done is open up your sheets. Don't forget to go File, Make a Copy, otherwise you'll not be able to edit it, and open up your GIS map. Then that'll allow us to get into the first of our tasks. Now this is some preparation for your AS Unit 3, which is your skills-based unit, in which we've got to cover mapping techniques and we've got to cover graphing techniques. Now all of it will be done by hand in the actual exam, but using some of these digital tools allow us to explore some of the pros and cons of different choices that you'll make in ways and you can present things, because we can sort them and change them and tweak them much more quickly. Okay, so let's jump into the first of the task, which is to compare the HDI, that's the Human Development Index, with the GNI per capita. So to do that, we're going to be selecting columns C and D, and the easiest way to do that is if you click here in cell C1, scroll down till you get to the bottom of this data set. It's big, as you can see, because it's a global data set. Press and hold shift, very important. Press and hold shift. Did you hear that? That's me doing it. Then click there and that selects them all. It's as simple as that. Columns C and D. Okay, we go then to insert and the chart, and it will pop the chart in for us up here at the top. Or did it? Where did it pop the chart? Maybe it's put down here at the bottom, just to mix things up a little bit. So what your software like this will do is try to anticipate the graph that you will want to draw. There's various different ways in which you can present this data. It defaults to the scatter chart, which is exactly the right way to draw the data. But if I click down here, say, and get it to draw, let's say, a column chart, it shows it like that. And it's just much harder to see. It's much harder to pick anything out. That's not the format that you want. The format that you want here is your scatter chart. Or more formally, and this is the thing that you'll need to know for your AS3 section question 2, which is, why would you choose this graph, why a scatter graph or a line graph, variations in the same thing, when you've got these data sets here? And here's your answer: because both of these have numbers. Or in other words, they're two sets of quantitative values, numbers along there, numbers along there. And because you've got two sets of numbers, that means that the appropriate way to draw the graph is with a scatter chart or a line graph. So justify your choice of graphing technique. That's it. You've two sets of quantitative values, and this is the appropriate format to use. Now we're going to do a few tweaks here, because these dots there's so many values in the data set that the dots are overlapping. So I'm going to click on any one of those dots and it'll open up this customize menu here, series. Well, I want to change the point size. Let's bring it down to 2. That's definitely an awful lot better. You can see that there's other bits and pieces you can do here, but the circle is absolutely fine for me. Then I want to draw on the trend line, because whenever you're describing any kind of graph, you will want to describe the trend. I'm going to change the color to make it stand out a little bit more. What I can see here is that this trend line is showing us that there's definitely a trend here. There's definitely a trend. But it's maybe not the best type of trend line to put on, because you can see here most of the dots are below the trend line, and here most of the dots are above the trend lines. That's just drawing it on as a line. We have some other options here. We can set this as an exponential, and what do you see? There's our trend line there. The trend line seems to be going through the middle of the dots much more effectively on something like this. I can even make this a little bit bigger so that we can see it better. There's our trend line going through the middle of our dots in our graph like this, and it's just a much more effective way, I think, of drawing the trend line, because what you can see here is that it starts off quite low, and as the Human Development Index improves, the gross national income per person doesn't really change that much. But then once you get over a Human Development Index of about 0.7, then it starts to increase much more rapidly. And as the HDI increases, the GNI per capita increases quite considerably. So there's your trends. You've got to describe the overall trend. That's the overall trend, and the trend line helps. But then you've also got to pick up your anomalies. So there are definitely some anomalies that sit up here. There's some that have high HDIs that are way, way up in terms of the income, in terms of what you would expect, and that one way, way up there, which is absolutely crazy. So you want to pick up the trends and the anomalies, and that's basically how you do it. To copy your graph, you'll click on those three little dots there, copy chart, and come back in here, and we'll just paste this in. You can paste it linked or unlinked, it doesn't really matter. There you go. So, draw your suitable graph, justify your choice, why you're doing it, 2 sets of quantitative values, what's your trend, and what are your anomalies. So that's number 1. Okay, then we're going to do a bar graph of HDI and world countries. So let's go back into our graph, our spreadsheet here. I'm just going to get rid of that, don't need that anymore. And this time it's HDI and world countries. So I'm going to select the data in the same way, only this time is column B and C. So I'm clicking here and scrolling down. But I'm going to hit shift, listen for it, hit and hold shift, click. And there you've got that data set collected or selected. This time we're going to go insert chart. And the histogram is the default one. This is the one that ultimately we wanted to draw. So I'm going to leave it on here just for now because that's ultimately the best format that I think this data set will go in. So why histogram for something like this? Well, actually, let me change it into a bar chart because you may be more familiar with your bar charts, your column charts like this. I'll show it to you like this. Why is this a bar chart and not a line graph or scatter graph? The answer is because you've got in column C one set of quantitative numbers and in column B words or qualitative. Qualitative and column C is quantitative. Quantities and qualities. Numbers and words. And when you've got a quantitative and a qualitative set of data, your format is very often going to be a bar chart. So I'm just going to copy this chart and we'll paste it in here for this one. Paste. Again, doesn't really matter what you select there. And the question again is to justify your choice of graphing technique. It's a bar chart because numbers and words. Qualitative and quantitative. That's the appropriate form. However, as I said, actually, there's maybe better ways of presenting this data. So if I hit undo, that's going to bring us back to the histogram. Now, what does a histogram show? What's the difference between a histogram and a bar chart? Let me just copy this and we'll paste it into our graph here. So let me resize these so that we can see them both side by side. They're showing exactly the same data sets, exactly the same information, but they're presenting it differently. So I suppose the question is, what does the histogram allow you to see much more clearly than the bar chart can't? Well, part of that is in, the answer to that is in the way in which the histogram displays the data, because what you've got here are different groups into which you're putting your data here. So between 0.35 and 0.4 and so on. These are different categories or groups into which you're placing your data. And you're saying basically that I want you to take all of the countries that lie between 0.35 and 0.4 and I want you to put them in there. How many are there? 3. 5, yeah, 3. And then there are 5 in this one. There are 10 here, 10 countries in this group, 14 and 16 and so on you go through. Then you realize actually the most popular group here is this one with 26 between 0.7 and 0.75, and then it goes down a wee bit and up again to 23 and down here at the top. So because you're putting them into groups or categories like that, what it allows you to do much, much better is to see the spread of the data set. What is the spread of HDI values across the world? And we can see actually most countries in the world have HDI values above 0.7, and you start to move down here and you see that this is definitely grouped here towards the higher values, especially this one and this one here. And you begin to see how this lets you see the spread of these data sets as you move across. And that's why it's a useful data set, and why it's different from the bar chart. The bar chart doesn't allow you to see that same spread. Maybe if your eye is trained, you begin to see evidence of it in there, but you'll not see it anywhere near as clearly as you will in the histogram. So we have these different ways of presenting the graph. When you've got two sets of quantitative values, you definitely want to have your line graph or your scatter graph, whichever way you want to refer to it. Whenever you've got quantitative and qualitative, you want to put it into a bar chart, and you can also display that in a histogram. Now, you may well be saying, hold on a minute, Mr. Hamill, there's numbers up the side, there's numbers down there. Yeah, that's another category. Another way that you can look at this is that this data set is put into discrete groups or categories, whereas the data set for this is continuous. It gradually changes. There are no discrete groups or categories there. So this is a continuous data set, and therefore it's better shown on something that shows that continuous change, that scatter graph. This is in discrete little groups. It's discontinuous, therefore you draw your histogram. So whenever you're putting it in here, draw the histogram, copy and paste it. One of the benefits of the histogram rather than the bar chart, the benefit of the histogram is that it allows you to see the spread of this data set an awful lot more clearly than you can in the bar chart alone. Which brings us then to taking a little bit of a look at how you would map this data. I'm going to show you something pretty cool that you may not know that this can do. Let's just delete that, get rid of that for a moment, and let's just select this data set again, press shift and hold, click, and I can go insert and I can go chart, and it's going to default to the histogram. But will you see this? If I drop down menu here and I scroll down towards the bottom, you see, my goodness, did you know that spreadsheets can actually draw your maps for you like this as well? And this is now just drawing us a map where it is mapped all of these data sets for us. And anything, Excel sheets can do this for you. You can present exactly the same data set in maps like this. But you don't get the same ability to control and tweak things here that you would in a GIS map. But I just want you to see that you can actually draw that in here using sheets. But if we come in here, we have got this in Excel, in ArcGIS, and it's going to give us a little bit more control over this. And this is where I want you then to start to think a little bit more about your mapping. This is a choropleth mapping technique. Now, you'll use a choropleth mapping technique whenever you have data sets that go into particular areas. So you will have information here of HDI value of 0.74 in that area, that country of Algeria. Choropleth map here in the country of Mali, you'll have an HDI value of 0.43. But the reason why I want you to come in here is because it allows you to do a little bit of tweaking with this. I'll just talk my way through this, what I'm doing here actually. So what I want you to do is to change a little bit of the mapping of the choropleth map here in Africa. So if I click on this layer and then I click on these little symbols here, that's going to take me into these menus where I have a little bit of control of what I can display. And I want to click on this one here in terms of options. And what it will do is to show you, what's that? That's the histogram. That is our histogram, very, very similar, pardon me, to this histogram here. Is presenting the data for us in the histogram. And we can choose the groups that we want to put the map into based on the spread of the data across the histogram. Now here's the thing with this histogram. This is a histogram for the entire world. And there's a big, big range across the entire world. But what that tends to do is to make Africa kind of look very, very similar. So what I can do is to begin to change this a little bit so that what I'm showing here reflects the full spread in Africa a little bit more. And I do that by dragging some of these around. So if you see as I drag around, some of the reds begin to disappear. Now, I've got far too many oranges there in Africa, so I can drag this down now. And it'll start to bring on some of the greens. And wouldn't it be nice to get some of the dark greens appear in Africa? How far down do you need to go before I get the dark greens appearing? And I'm starting to get that appearing there a little bit more. And I can start to move these around just a little bit to give me a sense of where these countries are appearing. And all of a sudden, I get a very, very different story being told about the continent of Africa, depending on where I set those groups for my different colours for the choropleth map. Those groups are known as your class intervals, the intervals between each of those classes. So the groups that I've set there allows me to tell a different story than was the case that I would have got with the default setting. So there's the default setting again. And again, let's see that process that we go on where we're going to drag these around a little bit more and try to tell a story that shows the diversity of Africa as much as possible. Maybe you want to experiment and go up to 5 different categories. Maybe that tells even more of a story. And we start to drag these around a little bit more and tell whatever story it is we want to tell to show the diversity that exists within Africa as much as the diversity across the world. Now, once you've done that, Windows Shift S, and you can screen grab your map of Africa, and you're going to pop that in here with your choropleth map. Oh, by the way, sorry, put in the default one first of all. Then this is your choice here, what you're going to do with it. And I also want you to do this. I'd like to see your key. How are you changing this? How are you moving this around? So you will end up with, let's if I go back in here and do that. So if I just take that back to the default for the 5 groups, let's say you want to start with 5 groups. Let's copy and paste that from there into there. And you have 2 maps that are mapped differently that maybe tell you a slightly different story. All because you have changed the class intervals of your data set. You've looked at the histogram and you've thought that histogram is for the entire world. I want to pull this down here a little bit more to reflect a little bit better the full spread within Africa. And lo and behold, you tell a very, very different story. Now, I suppose a question, why wouldn't you do that from the start? Well, if we zoom out, that's why, because you've now told a much more interesting and nuanced story about Africa, but all of the rest of the world looks entirely the same. And that's a little bit of a criticism you might have of these choropleth maps, that the story that you tell from the choropleth maps can very much reflect where you put your class intervals and the groups that you choose. Now, when you're hand drawing this, you'll have to decide this right from the offset, and when we're teaching how to hand draw them, we'll show you how to do that. But the beauty of doing this in GIS is that you can change, you can tweak, and in real time you can see the impacts that your tweak's having, and you can decide very carefully and very precisely where you want to place these in order to try and tell as accurate and true a story as possible. So your question here is to justify your choices. Why did you set them the way they were? And you can reflect something of what I've just said. So this little task is designed, as I say, to get you to think about the different types of graphs that you might draw and your justification, why that might be the case, the difference between the bar chart and the histogram, and then why using the histogram in this GIS choropleth map allows you to experiment a little bit more with your presentation to tell as interesting and as accurate a story as possible.